Friends and travelers, however you've arrived, I bid you welcome. Here at Let's Be Frank, we're about lives, and above all, living well. I don't expect a podcast hosted by Benjamin Franklin could be about anything else. In my lifetime, I pursued the practice of moral improvement like a science, recording my successes and, yes, oftentimes reveling in my failings. It's my hope, with our weekly almanac, to give to a curious world delicious morsels of history in quick, easy-to-digest installments. Perfect for a sit in your favorite chair or a morning walk to work. At the end of each installment, I like to wrap it all up in a neat little lesson that you can apply to your own life, inspired by the events, stories, and personalities shared in each episode. So sit back, relax, and together, let's make history. Greetings and salutations, dear listener. Welcome to another installment of Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind with me, your faithful friend and host, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, Printer. I must confess, my dear Junto, I find myself terribly excited for this particular edition of our auditory almanac. Why? Well, I'm very glad you asked. Thank you for your consideration, dear listener. When I embarked upon this little odyssey, it was always my hope to foster amongst our community a like-minded group of people, of 21st century polymaths who would, from time to time, speed the plow of thought by submitting questions we can answer on the show. Now, today, we're going to open the show with a question submitted from one of our listeners on Instagram. Miss Clarissa Marie, at a little spark of madness, wrote to me asking the following. Good day, Dr. Franklin. I'm dying to know, is the story about the King of France having a chamber pot with your face on it true? I heard it once in history class as a kid, and I've always wondered. P.S. I love what you're doing here. Keep it up. Oh, thank you, madam. I'm so happy to answer this question. It is, indeed, completely true, although His Majesty did not hold on to it for long, and it may not be the compliment that it would initially appear to be. Now, you see, my arrival in France brought with it a bit of a Franklin fever amongst the nobility of France. Whether sympathetic with the cause of America or not, my presence in Paris was felt with an electric fervor. In fact, I very quickly earned the nickname that embodied just that, the Electric Ambassador. It's important to remember that France's monarchy was absolute, His Majesty the King having ultimate say in law, policy, and alliance. And in 1776, when I arrived in France, the young king was adamant to stay uninvolved in the dispute between Great Britain and her colonies. This stance is what makes the young Marquis de Lafayette's choice to come to America so heroic, but that's a story for another time. One of His Majesty's courtesans, the Duchess de Polignac, was particularly known for her ardent zeal for the cause of America, and a particular zeal for a certain American diplomat, who quickly developed an ardent zeal for her. There was a portrait made much later of the Duchess placing a laurel upon the crown of my head, and if that's not a perfect summation of our dynamic, I don't know what is. His Majesty made the gift of Madame de Polignac a chamber pot with my face at the bottom of the basin. A deliberate derision of yours truly, and quite the gift for one's #1 fan. Don't you think, dear listener? Thank you so much for the question, Miss Marie, and a reminder to our junto, we absolutely love questions and curiosities submitted from members of our junto, and we encourage you to reach out across the various social media platforms. You can find us at Be Franklin Live on Instagram, TikTok, and Let's Be Frank on Facebook. Now, we've also, this week, embarked into yet another digital terra incognita and started our very own YouTube channel. You can find us there at Be Franklin Live, the same handle that you can find us on Instagram and TikTok. I will be sharing the content you love there, as well as eventually creating longer videos, once I discover the means to cultivate more hours in the day, which I confess I have not yet. I confess, my friends, it's a true delight to see not only our Junto grow, but to have you engage with us. There are few things we love more in this world than the budding community of wisdom seekers our Junto is becoming. In fact, this episode is the direct result of your curiosity. My friends, there is a topic of late that has come across my desk more and more since boldly stepping out into the world of digital media. It has to do with where I resided in London, and some cadaverous and macabre discoveries made over 200 years after I resided there. And my beloved Junto, you requested it, and I, your poor and humble servant, am bound to address it. So today, we're going to do an episode about the bodies in the basement. For purposes of good order, this podcast is composed of several primary sources associated with Ben Franklin's life, knit together to collect it all into one narrative on a cohesive theme. Today's episode is about soured friendships. It's about the things we bury, and it's about how sometimes those things don't stay buried. Now, it's well known to most that, of my contemporaries, I was by far the most transcontinental. Long-standing listeners of our Junto will recall that I was abroad for almost the entirety of the decade that led to our separation with Great Britain, making only a critical cameo at the end for the good part, a deus ex franklia, if you will. For 16 years prior, in a little townhouse on Craven Street, just off the Strand, I resided in the good care and company of my landlady, Miss Margaret Stevenson, and her daughter, Polly. That chapter's known for several things. The company I kept, the things I learned, the frequent habit of taking medicinal air baths on the balcony of that abode, and of course, for what was found in the basement of that home 200 years later. Now, my friends, the history we're going to begin with today is still the distant future for me, but more recent than perhaps the history you're accustomed with. Journey with me almost 30 years into your past. Now, the home that I occupied on Craven Street has long fallen into disrepair. It's a ruin existing in a city fixed on ever-expanding, and, like so many things over the course of time, risks falling away into ruin to make way for the new. Now, by the 1990s, a group of people called the Friends of Franklin began work to restore that Craven Street home to be able to share it for future generations. They go through the customary process of excavation, conservation, restoration. However, they pause as they begin the excavation of the basement. You see, they find something peculiar. Amidst the rubble, ruin, and dirt, they find a human thigh bone. They continue digging, and they find a skull. They dig some more, and by the end, they uncover over 5 bodies, 6 in total, ranging in age from infant to infirm, child to elder. And it wasn't only the quantity of the bodies that gave pause, dear listener, but rather the condition they were discovered in. For you see, several of the skulls had holes drilled into them. Several of the thigh bones had knocks from a knife cut upon them. What the devil was taking place in that Craven Street home? They contacted a coroner, and the following comes from a newspaper marked the 11th of February, 1998. Initial estimates are that the bones are about 200 years old and were buried at the time Franklin was living in the house, which was his home from 1757 to 1762 and from 1764 to 1775. Most of the bones show signs of having been dissected, sawn, or cut. One skull has been drilled with several holes. Paul Knappman, the Westminster coroner, said yesterday, "I cannot totally discount the possibility of a crime. There is still a possibility that I may have to hold an inquest." So not only were bodies discovered in the basement of my former home, but it was discovered that those bodies were placed within the basement while I lived in that home. Well, dear listener, what do I have to say for myself? The answer is, well, not as exciting as you think, although the story behind it is very exciting in different ways. Now, what was the source of the Craven Street corpses? The source of which was a young protege of mine who, by fate and happenstance, came to operate his anatomy school out of that Craven Street home. Young Dr. William Hewson. Now, it's important to note in my time, dear listener, the time that we call the Age of Enlightenment was a time of questioning. It's part of what makes this era of history so fascinating. We questioned everything, the plants, the animals, the stars in the sky, and we began to question, yes, human anatomy for the purpose of understanding how we might care for one another in health. Schools of Edinburgh were famed schools of medicine, and because of the nature of the profession, requires one to get one's hands dirtier than perhaps other professions. An astronomer may simply study the stars with a telescope. A botanist may learn from plants by taking a walk in the woods. But a surgeon, well, to understand his trade properly, he must have a body. Young William Hewson's focus was primarily in blood, hematology, a student of the famed anatomist Dr. William Hunter. Hewson ran in the highest circles of society, made connections of some of the greatest minds, and held in his future nothing but promise. I made the acquaintance of young Mr. Hewson in the 1760s, as did my landlady's daughter, Miss Polly Stevenson. Now, very quickly, Mr. Hewson began to become just as infatuated with the anatomy of Miss Stevenson as the anatomy of the figures he was studying, much to the frustration of Dr. William Hunter. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. It's not the bodies in the basement that truly warrant a fascination with this story, but rather the lover's spat between two Williams. Dr. William Hunter had a falling out with young Hewson, which is how Mr. Hewson began to run the anatomy school out of the Craven Street home. Now, when Dr. Hunter began to seek some form of mediation, he approached yours truly, and this is how I come to be involved in the whole affair. And there are two primary sources that survive between that unique season, that falling out between two partners. The first source, the complaints of Dr. William Hunter against William Hewson from July of 1771, and the second source, William Hunter's stipulations in regard to William Hewson, the 23rd of August, 1771. The first source, complaints of William Hunter. Now, in the autumn of 1762, William Hewson, Polly Stevenson's husband-to-be, entered into partnership with Dr. William Hunter, the famous anatomist, to give lectures and demonstrations to medical students. In 1769, Hunter finished building a new house in Great Windmill Street, where Hewson had a small apartment. The two now shared equally in the profits of the course. Hewson and Polly were married on July 10th, 1770. And soon afterward moved into a house near Hunter's. But in the spring of 1771, Hunter announced that the partnership would be dissolved the following winter because Hewson's family responsibilities were preventing him from giving enough time to his work. Now, both men took their troubles to me, being well acquainted with their labors. Now, I recorded 2 memorandums regarding my conversations with each. And it's these memorandums that I'll share for you today. Now, here are the complaints of William Hunter. The first, that he gave leave to go to Blenheim once, but not repeatedly, not for an absence of 10 days from business, which was the more inconvenient, as Dr. Hewson was then indisposed with a lax. I'll have you look up what a lax is, dear listener. It's not polite to bring up upon the podcast. 2. That Dr. Hunter has not only suffered the loss of Mr. Hewson's time in assistance, but by his management has lost a friend. 3. That Mr. Hewson would have used a body of Dr. Hunter's purchasing to make a skeleton, who it could not be expected should purchase bodies for him for such purposes. Next, that he had employed a man to pick bones out of the tubs and fit up a skeleton for him, without leave of Dr. Hunter, which ought not to have been done till the lectures were over. Next, that Mr. Hewson's behavior to Dr. Hunter was extremely rude, and that he had said he was a fool to expect that Dr. Hunter would act like a gentleman. Next, that for this reason he, Dr. Hunter, must now come to a dead stand, and insist on a specific and exact compliance with the articles that Mr. Hewson should expect nothing from him for the future but what those entitled him to. That however this resolution should have no retrospect, that he had endeavored to serve Mr. Hewson, who had turned that endeavor to his prejudice. He could therefore no longer be his friend, though he should not be his enemy. Next, that he had taken a guinea of 2 dissecting pupils who had not been attended for Dr. Hunter, contrary to his express declaration that he would have nothing. Next, that Mr. Hewson complained of being prevented giving half the lectures, but Dr. Hunter, knowing his dislike to giving such a required much speaking, had given those to Mr. Hewson, that he had offered to leave it to the free choice of the pupils, which Mr. Hewson had declined, that he had refused to give one which Dr. Hunter had requested him to give, that Dr. Hewson should not have given so many, but that he had been informed the pupils were not so well satisfied with Mr. Hewson's lecturing, at least on some points. Next, that Dr. Hunter began by saying, I had got into an unpleasant situation that of hearing the complaints of 2 persons who could not agree, that he was sorry to give me the trouble of hearing his, but it was in some degree necessary, as he supposed I heard the others. At the conclusion, I told him I should think it no trouble to hear their complaints if I could be of the least use in accommodating their differences. But since that was not likely, I could only wish, as I had a regard for both, that they would go on to the end of their terms as quietly as possible, since that would be the most to the credit of both, that I had given and should give this advice to Mr. Hewson, which I hoped he would follow. As some other particulars of complaint were mentioned, such as Mr. Hewson's calling the house his, and threatening to break into it, proposing to make preparations of 2 fetus heads which Dr. Hunter had already prepared. The lectures were of little importance now to Dr. Hunter, but he had built a house for them, and must either continue them or lose the expense, unless he let the house. I thought he was about to intimate that if Mr. Hewson had behaved well, he might have let it to him, but he did not go so far. After making these complaints through mediation, we eventually arrived at Dr. Hunter's stipulation as to how he should interact with Mr. Hewson. August 23rd, 1771. Dr. Hunter expects Mr. Hewson should go on with his business as usual during the remainder of the term they are to continue together, and during that time should make preparations at Dr. Hunter's expense, such as the doctor should direct to be made, and others so that those directed are not neglected or omitted, that all the preparations are to be the doctor's sole property and at his absolute disposal, so that if he afterwards should give any of them to any person, which he would not be understood to promise, such gift is to be considered as the sole effect of his good will. Now, unfortunately, the 2 Williams would never reconcile in their friendship. The young Dr. Hewson's focus was in hematology, the study of blood. Here's where the story grows both sad and ironic. Upon slipping with a scalpel one day, young Dr. Hewson received blood poisoning, an ague which he would not recover from, and would meet an untimely end shortly after the falling out with his partner. And Dr. William Hunter would go on to have a very long career, putting forward various contributions to the field of medicine that are worth talking about, just not on this platform. So that's how the bodies came to occupy the Craven Street home. Now, I know the question you all must be thinking is, how did they procure those bodies? Now, there were various methods in that time, both legal and extra-legal. One of the most fruitful sources of bodies were criminals. Under the Murdering Act of 1752, high-level crimes became punishable by dissection, meaning After you were executed publicly, your body was then distributed to medical schools for that exact purpose. That particular clause was meant to be further incentive to obey the laws. The threat of dissection was also used to discourage less heinous but equally disruptive crimes, such as dueling. There is a 1784 Massachusetts law that states that a slain duelist would either be buried in a public place without a coffin or given to a surgeon for dissection. And then, of course, there are the extra-legal measures. To meet the growing demand, the practice of robbing graves of freshly buried persons became rampant in the 18th century. If the soil was soft and the grave shallow, a thief with a partner could exhume a body in less than an hour. Most bodies were stolen between November and March, when medical schools were in session, and the cold helped preserve the corpses. The corpses were transported often by wagon for sale to local anatomy professors, as professors would accept only bodies that had not badly decomposed. 10 days was usually the limit between death and burial. The public was well aware of the practice of grave robbing. They often referred to the perpetrators as night doctors, sack-em-up men, body snatchers, while anatomy professors called them by the more dignified term, resurrectionists. So, dear listener, I hope you enjoyed the little bit of resurrection regarding the recent topic of the bodies discovered in my home. And I think the topic of conversation for today gives me an idea for a fitting lesson for today's installment. At the final portion of Dr. Hunter's complaints, there were several phrases that stick out in my mind that I think worth revisiting. Dr. Hunter began by saying that I had got into an unpleasant situation, that of hearing the complaints of two persons who could not agree. At the conclusion, I told him I should think it no trouble to hear their complaints if I could be of the least use in accommodating their differences. Now, how many times in the course of our lives, dear listener, have we found ourselves in the middle of a dispute that does not involve us? An individual comes to us, prepared to speak ill of another person who is a mutual acquaintance. How many times does it become juicy to simply settle in to that particular situation and revel in the complaints and chance to gossip? I think the lesson for today, dear listener, is when you find yourself in the unpleasant situation of hearing complaints of two persons who could not agree, seek to be the remedy in the situation. Seek to be the medicine. Seek to resurrect those friendships. Now that's all for today's installment. Would that we had more hours in the day, but as always, we have nothing but time between us. Resource materials and images from this week's episode can be found in the journal section of bfranklinlive.com. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at bfranklinlive, and Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind on Facebook. Love the wit and wisdom of Let's Be Frank? Consider supporting our Junto by joining our Patreon today. You can find the link to it in today's show notes. And, dear listener, spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your horse, I don't care. Let's make our intellectual Junto grow. And now, dear listener, our time together must come to an end. Fare thee well. And always remember, when you're good to others, you're best to yourself. Until we meet again, I remain your humble and obedient servant, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, Printer. Stay curious, my friends.